1, 2, 3.
The following is a Laura Flanders Show audio exclusive.
On the 24th of February, Russia launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was a major escalation of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict that has actually been going on, particularly since 2014, for years. As we record this, Russia's invasion is almost a month old. Millions of people have been uprooted. Unknown numbers have been injured and killed. And long-term damage has been done to the air, water, and land of a country that until just now was the breadbasket for much of the world. In the U.S., commercial media have brought us wall-to-wall reporting, for better and worse, with presidents and politicians, military experts, and war victims. But on this program, we start from the premise that there are always more people and more perspectives than are seen in the commercial picture. We seek to fill those gaps right here, and our guests today do just that. They've been working for democracy, peace, and justice in Ukraine and Russia for years and partnering with similar efforts around the world. Their work has gotten harder, as you'll hear, but it hasn't stopped. And the need for it is even more urgent now, because what happens next will have long-lasting impacts on all our lives. From Russia, Dmitry Makarov is a human rights defender and the youngest member of the Moscow-Helsinki Group, the oldest active human rights organization in what's historically called the post-Soviet space. Joining us from Berlin after having to leave Ukraine is Anastasia Lukkina of the Kiev School of Economics, where she directs the Horizontal Connections NGO, about which we will hear more in just a bit. And from Washington, D.C., where she directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, Phyllis Bennis. She's also a fellow at the Transnational Institute and recently wrote the piece, "The Best Way to Help Ukraine is Through Diplomacy, Not Weapons." I want to thank you all for joining us and start by going to you, Anastasia. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself, your people, your friends and relations, how you are, where you are, and who is on your mind as we speak?
Yes, thank you for the invite. I have a colleague whose name is Nina, and she lived in a small village near Zaporozhye, which is heavily attacked by the Russian military. And she has been, her village has been under a Russian occupation for the last some days, and she did not have water, electricity, or heat in the last 2 weeks. She just lives there with her parents and her daughter, and today she decided to leave the place, and I hope she is safely evacuated. But she is one of my core team members who has been helping with all our activist efforts, and her story is just one of those really heartbreaking stories when you worry about people's lives and them not being able to make it on evacuation buses because Russian military just shoot humanitarian convoys and buses with people who are trying to flee from the war.
And what about you, Dmitry? Who's on your mind?
Well, I mean, I had so many communications in the past few days, but I'm really grateful for the few communications that I was able to make with my Ukrainian colleagues who, despite all this, are able to have conversations about what kind of world we want to build out of this, and how do we continue together through all of this. I think those are the ones that have been the most touching, but I can tell of some others maybe later on.
Well, tell us a bit more, because people have very little sense of how Russian movements, how Russian civil society is, well, they have very little sense of what Russian civil society looks like in this moment.
Well, I mean, rightfully, the attention has been on the main victims of this war, which is the Ukrainian people. And the solidarity that they are experiencing, I mean, is amazing and gives me hopes. For Russians, it has not been that easy because they are blamed, and in part, rightfully so, for the aggression. And among my friends, which oppose the war, about a third had to leave the country also, scrambling for neighboring places like Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and so on, Turkey. About a third has decided to stay, myself included, to continue to coordinate and connect various anti-war initiatives that are springing up locally, nationally, and international connections. And about a third are still numbstruck, still in denial about what's going on.
Phyllis, you are in touch with people around the world, but I'd love you to talk a bit about who's on your mind in this country. Take your pick. Who are you thinking about at this moment?
There are so many. There are so many. Certainly Ukrainians who are here, friends. I have friends from Russia and Belarus as well who are desperately trying to figure out if there's anything they can do to help end this war more quickly. But certainly, as Dmitry just said, the real point on our minds has to be the people of Ukraine who are suffering through this. It is a question for the world. This war is different from a lot of other wars, not only in all the ways that every war is different. No war is identical, except that the suffering happens in every war. But it's also true that the consequences of this war are more immediately global. It's more immediately visible how the long-term and even medium-term consequences of this war are going to affect people all over the world. What you mentioned earlier, Laura, about the Ukraine and Russia as parts of the breadbasket of the world. 25% of all the wheat in the world is produced in those two countries. And right now, the possibility of producing anything close to the usual harvest is pretty much gone. And that's going to have a huge effect on people across Africa, on the poorest people in South Asia, all parts of the world. The price of bread is going to skyrocket. People at the UN, I did a lot of work at the UN over the years, and people there I know who work in places like UNICEF and the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization are completely, desperately trying to figure out what they're going to do when wheat that they have assumed they would have access to feed earlier refugee flows who are now in refugee camps all over the world, what they're going to do to get bread. And it's a huge challenge for all of us.
Anastasia, back to you. First off, can you tell us where you are now and how long you've been there? And then give us some sense of what kind of work you were engaged in before the Russian invasion.
Yes, I'm currently in Berlin, and it took us quite a while to get my mother out of the country. She stayed for 2 weeks in Kiev, and she's on palliative care. So when it was getting really hot and dangerous, we convinced her to leave the country, and it took her. She doesn't drive, but she had my car, and it took her 4 days to move from Kiev to Warsaw, and we had to find 5 different drivers to get her there on the way. And basically those were people that we didn't know. I just used Facebook to find drivers. And we also had 2 minors, 2 kids whose parents we didn't know in the car, and we just transported them to Warsaw to save their lives. And it was a very stressful trip for her. And I myself and my son, we ended up not being able to return to Ukraine from a vacation in Egypt. So we ended up being stuck in Egypt with a pair of fins and summer clothes, and no evacuation backpack on us. So we reunited in Warsaw and came to Berlin yesterday. And it's a very stressful time. I can feel that my mind and my cognitive ability have been really down, and my memory, because I think as all Ukrainians, we are trying to juggle so many things, like helping our friends and families in our cities, because the city I am from, Chernihiv, is under siege for many weeks now, and it's a terrible humanitarian situation. Kharkiv is under siege and really heavily bombed, and I mean, everybody knows what's happening in Mariupol. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, and there are so many children and women and just normal civilians that are being hurt. Today they bombed a shopping mall in Kiev. So it's just it's ridiculous destruction. And when you ask me about what I did in the peaceful times, I almost forgot by now, because I think these 3 weeks of war has been just erased everything that was happening before. But but I've been teaching a lot, and I've done a lot of activism in the area of advocating for human rights and access to intensive care units in healthcare. And I published a book, which is called The Non-Scary Book about life, death, and everything in between for people on palliative care and with challenging diagnosis on how to support these people and live in a country without infrastructure. And then we, just before the war, we published another book, a teacher's guide to empathy and humanity in healthcare. And we have introduced this as a separate course into medical universities to help doctors be more human and more effective in their communication with the patients.
And this horizontal NGO work that you were doing at the university, can you just tell us a little bit more of what that was or is?
Yeah, it's a very small non-governmental organization, and we basically had two major lines of work. One is activism in alternative education, and we have been helping kids and parents to find different ways to escape oppression in the state system, and also help teachers change the way they teach kids. And the second direction of work was in healthcare, and it was the campaign to open intensive care units, and also the campaign to inform people about palliative care and ways to support patients and their families, and basically how to change the whole model of interaction within the healthcare system.
Anastasia, thank you so much. I mean, I ask these questions, and I know it is really a challenge to recall the world before these last 3 weeks. But I guess my point, and I'm coming to you, Dimitri, is to try to give people here some sense of the ongoing work that was happening even before this. Because sometimes in our media, we get given a picture only of the countries at war and not of what was there before or what networks could possibly be built in this moment, other than the ones that we see that are usually having to do with the military or the various highest level of government. Can you talk a bit about your work before and what you can fill in of our picture of the work that you were doing in this part of the world and the relations that people have, one with each other, across what is now a very brutal divide between Russia and Ukraine, but within families isn't that way at all?
Well, I mean, I hear Anastasia, and I very much relate to that, although I come from a very different perspective, but somehow we meet at the center of it. Because my work has been focused on giving a voice to the civil society from the so-called post-Soviet space, which is a name that I don't like, but we don't have a better name still. So the point that I was trying to make for many years is that we have to build civil society connections in that space, because the state of Russia is extremely influential. And you can't really build human rights, democracy in one given country without paying attention to transnational problems of corruption, of environmental issues, of human rights. And we try to build that transnational network, and we failed. On the other hand, inside Russia, we also try to build citizen mobilization around issues like police brutality or injustice at the courts. It's not just the point of concern for experts and litigators and organized NGOs. It's also a point of citizen mobilization, that citizens keep on asking questions. What is it that's going on behind closed doors? What are the acts that are committed in our name? And in a way, we were both successful and we failed, because all of this seems on one hand irrelevant at this very moment. But on the other hand, this is what is needed still, despite all the focus that goes on the military action. We still need citizen mobilization. We still need transnational connections. We need to be much better at something that we tried to do before, and we have to do it much faster, because this crisis has underlined that the old world and the old ways of dealing with the current problems are not enough. In that sense, we have all failed to prevent it, but there is hope in us realizing that failure, looking at the roots of it, and building on the great things that are happening despite all the horror that's going on.
Well, we're going to get to some of that, and I encourage you to jump in with one another if you hear things you want to respond to. But Phyllis, coming to you, I mean, failed. I hate to lay that at your particular door, but when it comes to new internationalism, I would love your take on what's happened here inside the U.S. I look at a very divided country here in the U.S. And a divided so-called left over this question of who's to blame for what happened with the invasion, Russia or NATO. Also over the disparate and distinct treatment of white Ukrainian refugees compared to migrants of color in any number of other situations, and Muslims. And of course, you know, we see a continuing struggle in this country around military and carceral policing, punishing responses to just about everything. And I'm not sure that that's connecting to the ongoing work of demilitarization and peace that you work with.
Thanks, Laura. You know, it is a huge challenge, and I don't think we've met it very well. It's beginning, but we have such a long way to go to not just learn, but to apply the lessons of earlier wars. There are lessons already from this horrific war. There are lessons that we can bring to our work against militarism. The linkage, as you mentioned, the linkage between police brutality and the militarization of our society at home connected to the militarization of US foreign policy around the world and earlier wars. So we have a huge role to play here, particularly because of the particular role of the United States as what still exists as the military superpower. It's no longer the unchallenged economic power, but it is still certainly the military power. The fact that the US and Russia together control more than 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world makes the stakes in this particular war even more dramatically dangerous than in earlier wars. But we do have lessons that are starting to be learned. You referenced some of them, Laura, when you talk about the issues of racism and hypocrisy, the xenophobia, of how in earlier refugee flows, if we look in Europe, the refugee flows of 2015, when tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and ultimately a couple of million people, mainly Syrians and mainly Afghans at that period, some from Libya, elsewhere in Africa, flooded into Europe looking for safety, safety from wars, in some cases, safety from climate crises, in other cases, safety from economic catastrophe. And they were met not with empathy at the borders, however insufficient, but met with absolute brutality, with new borders suddenly being erected, new walls of barbed wire to prevent people from crossing what had been open borders before. And we saw that, and we talked about it, and we began to learn those lessons. One of the things, ironically, that we're seeing now is a model, despite real contradictions in some questions, the treatment of African students, something like 20,000 African students who were trying to get out of Ukraine where they were studying and were turned away at the Polish border, at other borders. These are horrific examples, but broadly, the welcoming of Ukrainian refugees is not something to be resented because of its lack in other situations, but this now provides us the model. This is how refugees should be welcomed. The 24/7 coverage in the media, as insufficient as it is on a whole set of levels, at least we're hearing consistently about the humanitarian crisis that is underway in Ukraine in a way that we never heard about the humanitarian crisis that the US war was creating in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. These wars simply don't make it to the press here. And the goal of creating a global movement against war, against militarism, both in the immediate, a global mobilization now against war in Ukraine, against Russia's invasion, the most urgent call, also needs to look forward to the need to build a new architecture of diplomacy to replace the so-called security architecture based on NATO that has been the basis in Europe. And that means getting rid of this tendency for spending huge amounts of money in every country, starting with our own, on the military budgets.
So let me come to you, Anastasia. I mean, I'd love to hear your response to this. And I'm also reminded many of us in the U.S. against war, pro-peace, heard President Zelensky in the run-up to February 24th saying, stop the saber rattling. You're only going to make war more likely. What do we make of that now? Was he wrong? Were we wrong?
Well, it's kind of ironic because I have a degree in peace building from Notre Dame. And I am this like peace, no military and all of that, and peace education sort of advocate. And a couple of years ago, I wrote an article saying how much we have to create security through education and not through military budgets. And basically, I made an argument to relocate more money from military to educational system. And now, I mean, when we are attacked by real missiles and tanks and everything, I completely changed the perspective. And I think that as good as diplomacy is, it failed to prevent this war. So now we need military assistance. And I cannot believe I'm saying this, but actually we need real weapons to fight the weapons that we attacked with and to protect the people. So it's really important that on top of all the diplomacy level efforts that countries like the US and others will provide us with necessary military assistance, because if the war doesn't stop on the Ukrainian territory, it will move further into Europe and probably even further. So again, as a peace building graduate, it's very strange that I am making this argument now, but considering the situation and the losses that we have on the ground of civilians, we really need military assistance, and we really need modern warfare to fight this, and we need it as soon as possible, and time is a factor, and the sooner we get it, the more chances it is that we win.
Well, Phyllis, you're the one that wrote Diplomacy, Not Weapons or War. Is it an either or? I mean, can't we do both?
Well, I really understand what Anastasia is saying, and it's a huge challenge for how to answer this. You know, how we understand this always depends on when we start the clock. And if we look back, it's certainly true that so far diplomacy has failed. There is diplomacy underway. There have been some talks that seem to have made a certain level of progress, but not enough. And so far, we're hearing that Putin is still refusing to participate in diplomatic engagement at the highest level, which ultimately will be needed. And it's also true, it's not but it's and also true, is that if we look back just a little bit further, we see that the security architecture across Europe, the rise of NATO, the payment of billions and billions and billions of dollars and thousands of weapons and new weapon systems over and over again across the continent, mainly funded through the US and the wealthiest countries in Europe, that has failed. It failed to prevent the invasion. It didn't work. So there's an urgency right now, and we know that greater militarization creates more problems after.
So, Dimitri, do you want to jump in on this? And Anastasia, will definitely come back to you.
I mean, there is the urgency of it now, and I understand the dilemma. And some of my fellow friends and colleagues from the anti-war movement or from human rights movement are taking up arms now. And who I am to judge them? I'm not in a place to judge them or to condemn them. And it's a tragedy that they are faced with this situation. And there are concrete people who ordered this war who are to blame. But there is also a shared responsibility. The shared responsibility that we have somehow limited our notion of security to hardline military security. Although, I mean, as a part of the Helsinki movement, that was, in a way, a civil society attempt to shape the way security is treated, you know, in the Helsinki Accords, Moscow-Helsinki group arguing that it's not that the third basket of security, the human dimension of it, that includes human rights, rule of law, is just as important as economic stability and as hardline security. And that has been entirely forgotten. The amount of attention that has been given to that dimension is by no way compared to the amount of attention that has been given to other dimensions of it.
And I'm sure you would agree that the world missed an opportunity to stand up for those principles after the invasion of Crimea. I mean, talk about the violation of Helsinki.
I just remembered, I was sitting in 2014 when the annexation happened. I was in Crimea. I was there on the place. I watched it with my own eyes. And I was dumbstruck by the reaction of society that didn't understand it as a crisis of the legal norms. That the Budapest Memorandum went to hell, that the entire post-war agreements architecture went to hell. It wasn't taken seriously enough. And the Ukraine has taken that toll. It had to respond also with military means. And we somehow missed the opportunity as a civil society also to reach to each other and to deal with it comprehensively. Because the human rights reactions were also not enough in that situation. We needed a much more complex approach.
Which is, go ahead, Phyllis, and then Anastasia.
Just quickly, I was going to say that one of the aspects of that, which civil society is equally responsible as governments for allowing to happen, has been the sidelining, the complete sidelining of organizations like the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which redefined, or at least began the process of redefining security, as Dmitry has referenced, away from a solely military reality to a much broader understanding of what continental security across Europe means, involving Russia, involving Ukraine, involving all the countries of Europe, and of course, unfortunately, also involving the United States and Canada, which seem to believe they belong in every otherwise regional meeting that goes on. And that's our job here in the US, to stop that. But the notion of allowing organizations like the OSCE greater empowerment rather than being sidelined, even stripping away their human rights monitors from Ukraine, which happened early on in this crisis. And this has happened before. This happened in the 90s in the Balkan crises as well. So I think there are models we can look at to see how, even on the immediate level, this process of diplomacy can be moved forward. I think we're looking at a situation where there's going to be a diplomatic solution. The question is, how many more people must die before it gets put in place?
Well, it's a bit edgy for me to say this, but Crimea and the whole world's response to Crimea was like this diplomatic solution. I mean, in a way, there were no sanctions. I mean, there were sanctions, but it was not enough. And it just feels like, a guy raped a woman once, taking away part of the territory with Lugansk and Donetsk and Crimea. And the world said, well, we are deeply concerned in a very beautiful diplomatic language. And now he is raping us again, and probably will go further if he's not stopped. So this is why, with all due respect to diplomacy, but we really need military solution to this.
Well, what does that military solution look like, Anastasia? Because what it looks like from here, the next steps are nuclear. And that surely is not what you're calling for.
We need to close the sky, because basically most of the casualties happen because they have the capacity to bomb us from the sky. And I understand the sensitivity of this dialogue, but we really need to close the sky. Otherwise, we are losing so many civilians. We are just losing people every day. Like today, 8 people died in a shopping center in the middle of Kiev. We lost 115 children due to bombings and shootings. Families were shot on their way out of hot zones. And what kind of diplomatic solutions can be there under these circumstances? It can happen afterwards, but now we need purely military assistance, and not just weapons, but also help with managing and leading and making strategic decision on warfare.
But you don't share our concern that we feel here that the implementation of a no-fly zone could very quickly bring the U.S. into direct military conflict with Russia?
Well, the U.S. is kind of already involved in a direct conflict with Russia. So we just have to admit it. And again, we in Ukraine, we have this, it's a joke about being deeply concerned, and you are using this word again. I mean, being concerned is not enough in these circumstances. You really need to fight with us against this, because this evil force, and it's the force of authoritarianism, is going to come into your door. And the Ukrainian war is like, it's a global war. It's not just a territorial conflict, and I think we all have to understand that.
Dmitry?
I do agree that it is a global war, but I also in a hard position to say this, but I don't see a military solution to it, and that's the tragedy of it. You can't win a war with a nuclear power. You can't win when the whole world is at stake. And we have to the realization that it's a global war because we are all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat because the nuclear standoff will mean the end of the world, maybe. We are all in the same boat in realizing also the climate emergency. So we need a different understanding of it. I know it may sound not relevant enough to the situation when people are dying right now. But at the same time, for me, also, this is not the first war. I mean, for me, it didn't start in 2014. There was a war in 2008 when Russia went into Georgia. There was a Russian-Georgian war. Before that, there was a Chechen war that I remember. And before that, on the margins of all of it, there were also bombings of Belgrade, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. For me, it's also about the wars that are going on before our eyes. And we don't see a common response by countries maybe, but not by civil society. Where's the anti-war movement? We don't really see it on a global scale. So, but that's the complexity of it. We're trying to solve the solution of the current day, the solutions, the questions of the current day, the issues of the current day, the solutions from the previous eras. And that's what Putin is doing. He's thrown us back. He's thrown back into the Cold War mentality. He's thrown us back into the mentality that the superpowers can agree. And that's why, for example, the fate of Ukraine was discussed between Biden and Putin, with Ukrainian voices not really being heard. I mean, all sorts of complex issues here. But the tragedy of it, that it doesn't have a solution. What do? You fence off Russia, you invade it, you bomb it, you nuke it. How is it solved? We need the discussions about the real solutions that are sustainable.
So Phyllis, coming to you on this, and Anastasia, yes, we will come back. I hear Dmitry's question. Where is civil society, organized civil society in this moment? And I hear Anastasia that she was part of that. And in this moment, she has found herself in a position she never thought she would be in, calling for direct military intervention for her life and for the life of the people around her. We're looking at a Europe united as it hasn't been in decades, the exact opposite of what Putin presumably wanted. More NATO expansion, more militarization, more weapons, maybe not enough, but more weapons being transferred to the region. What happens to progressive movements broadly defined? And I am reminded, after the financial crash, the crisis of 2008 and before, we did see an Arab Spring, a push for democracy, differently successful in different places. But is there any chance of progressive forces emerging stronger from this, or only weaker?
I think there is a chance, but I think it will not be the first thing that happens. The first thing is, and we're seeing it already, as both Anastasia and Dmitry have said, progressive forces right now are very weak. We're not hearing those voices. Here, we're having a very hard time figuring out what's the strategy. The US progressive movements is pretty good. We don't always get it right, but we're pretty good at knowing how to challenge our own government's wars, partly because they have been so many of them, and there's been such a consistent move for war and militarization in this country since its origins in genocide and slavery.
We're not good at stopping those wars.
Not in stopping them, but we have built those movements. We haven't got it right all the time, but we know how to build those movements. What we're looking at now has happened before. In Libya in 2011, what started as a part of the Arab Spring, as an uprising for democracy that quickly was turned on by the government with a terrible impact on civilians. And there was a call for a no-fly zone from people on the ground in Libya. And it was absolutely understandable. They were desperate and they were looking for some way to protect themselves. In that case, we tried and failed to stop a no-fly zone. The no-fly zone was created. And the situation in Libya, of course, is far worse now than it was in 2011. I won't go through all the history of that, but it began with the understanding of the US Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert Gates, who said, people need to understand that a no-fly zone in Libya starts with going to war against Libya. That's not the end point. That's the starting point. Because he went on to explain, you can't just declare a no-fly zone. You have to create it. And that means going to war against the country that holds the anti-aircraft existing battalions and equipment, which is Russia, both inside Ukraine and inside Russia near the border, where they are firing artillery, etc. The no-fly zone won't prevent that. It won't prevent most of those deaths that are not caused by the planes, but are caused by artillery and missiles and rockets.
So quickly, Phyllis, what pathways do you see to peace, or to a step forward to the next chapter of this work?
The urgency of diplomacy right now, we have to be demanding it, we have to be insisting on it, and it has to be based on the things that have already been acknowledged from President Zelensky, the things that Russia has said were going to be on the table. There have to be continuing pressure from other countries for diplomacy, not simply for, we just saw the US giving another $15 billion, mainly in military support to Ukraine, and then another 800 million in new weapons just the other day. All of that is going on, but our focus, I think, needs to be on building a movement demanding diplomacy and looking forward at the same time as we deal with the urgency of now, people that are dying today.
But very quickly, diplomacy by whom and for what? I mean, we have a president who has been speaking to the leadership in China, speaking to the leadership, of course, in Ukraine, in Europe, you name it. There have been discussions. What I don't know is exactly the terms of those discussions, what they're about. And I'm still looking for what Dmitry mentioned, which was any taste of civil society at those tables.
There won't be civil society presence at the table until we have a civil society that is more of a presence in demanding that the negotiations happen, that diplomacy be real, not just a slogan. We can't simply assert the slogan. We need real mobilization. And here, at least, that's been very hard to come by.
Anastasia, diplomacy.
Well, I want to say a bit more about civil society on the ground in Ukraine, because I think it has been, there is a major breakthrough. There was one in 2014, and whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. The civil society as strong as ever in Ukraine. It basically, people from civil society learn how to organize themselves. And we are doing everything from procurement of military equipment to protective gear, to medical supplies, to evacuation, it's unbelievable. Even with donor blood supplies, it was fascinating that before people fled Kiev, they left so much donor blood in the bank that has never happened before in our entire history. So in that sense, I think, it's the whole country is fighting, and it's not just the military forces, but also the civic resistance that allows us to at least stop the military intervention. And I think we should also give credit to these organizations. And on top of military assistance, it would be great to provide support to non-governmental organizations and actors that are active on the ground. I know there is a big push to give money to international organizations because they are like the usual suspects, but what we see is that all local organizations have become very strong and very effective in providing assistance on the ground. So I would suggest that if people choose who to support, there are a number of credible local organizations that do all sorts of assistance, and it would be great to provide help and support to local organizations.
Thank you, Anastasia. We'll put some information at our website. Dmitry, for you, many people have their hopes pinned on some kind of internal opposition inside Russia, including inside the military. Are those hopes realistic?
Well, I mean, let me just say that let's not put our hopes in that, because also the military was involved in war crimes already. It's already smeared in blood. How can it be accepted as a party in any type of negotiation? And then how do you deal with the person in charge who is actually expert in this type of attempts of assassination or avoiding assassination? So, I mean, it's all very obscure, and I wouldn't hope on that. But my hope is with civil society, because I don't see a solution in the instruments that we have at the moment. All the instruments that we have been failing. We have to invent them anew. And that also means that civil society once more has to re-envision itself, maybe choose a better name, but talk about itself not only as a Ukrainian or Russian civil society, but a global actor that is there for humanity. I mean, it may sound utopian, but we already at the point, and the world is so interconnected that a crisis that would be probably a local crisis before that has so many global implications. And we just need to dig into it. And from that, build a more interconnected, more interrelated world where people have a voice, not just guns, not just presidents, but people. I don't know. I mean, on my bookshelf, I have an almanac that I bought in Istanbul, published by anti-war activists in 1913. I mean, it sounds very much true. I think we're much better equipped at the moment now to revise those instruments that we have. The OSCE, UN, Council of Europe, I mean, let's invent it anew. I mean, that's our chance. I mean, and amazingly enough, the Ukrainian people manage to come up with those solutions. I mean, President Zelensky has suggested an alliance of states that is addressing an aggressive war, for instance. That's something new to consider. How do we react? Can we actually argue that the crime of aggression, which is a war crime, can actually be persecuted? Can we have a tribunal for it? How would it be enforced? Can we finally have a movement, in the US included, for the better powers of International Criminal Court for persecution of individual war crimes? How can we have humanitarian assistance on the ground, which is not only limited to, the usual UN responses, but is fed by the energy of many people who want to help all around the world? I mean, there are many questions that could be considered. And unfortunately, and thankfully, I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a military person. I don't take those decisions. And I'm not going to go into that sphere. I'm going to try to do what I've been trying to do for many years before. And I think it's still relevant.
Are you able to talk with people in well, where are you, Dmitry? First off, I'm unclear where you are. And what do we, how do you keep your head clear when we're hearing most of the Russian population has really only one perspective on what's happening?
I don't think that's also true. I think Russian population is also quite diverse. I wouldn't overestimate the resistance to the war, but it is there. It is on unprecedented numbers. Just in a society that has been traumatized by so many historical things and has been beaten over the head, literally and figuratively for many years, that is incapable of organizing. But even in those conditions, it is organizing. So, and I still have hopes for it. I'm in Voronezh at the moment, which is a border region with Lugansk. So in a way, I can't say that I'm in the middle of it because I'm not in a war zone, but I'm near it, and I feel it because I have friends and colleagues on all sides of the battles.
I'm going to give our last word. Sorry, Phyllis, to Anastasia. We're out of time. This has been an extraordinary conversation, the like of which I'm not seeing anywhere. And I appreciate you all for being part of it. Anastasia, closing thoughts, and I'm sure, best to all of the people close to your heart and to your people right now.
Um, I just want to say what you can do to help us. And one is to share more news and truthful information about what is happening in Ukraine, and to provide support to people on the ground, both military and civilians. Second, please create public pressure on your government officials and your politicians and also your companies to leave Russia and to have strict sanctions and increase them and increase the pressure at all levels, and find diplomatic and military solutions, but also just leave Russia. And I know it's a painful decision, but you still have companies like Johnson and Johnson and Colgate that continue to work in Russia, despite the fact that most of the reputable businesses have left, because this pressure will help stop the war. And yes, and I also want to thank everybody and thank different countries and people who have been so responsive and so helpful and so supportive for our efforts. Thank you with all my heart.
Well, while I suspect you will have gotten the last word, I am also hearing from my team that they want to hear everybody's closing comments. So we're just going to keep going. Dmitry, then Phyllis, closing comments. And I think I meant not so much that the Russian people had one perspective, but rather that they were receiving one narrow picture of what was happening in Ukraine.
I think one of the last points that I want to make, that we are living in a world that is not only where decisions and the impact is not only made on the global geopolitical level. I think that one of the most interesting processes in Russia at the moment is how people challenge the authority in their family, where they argue about the war, to their parents who are much more receptive to government propaganda, how they argue, for example, in the universities, where the rectors of universities speak in favor of the war, representing the entire student body, and the students rebel against that, how there are feminist organizations speaking out about how the whole patriarchal thinking is very much implicated in this war. I mean, there are all sorts of dialogues that are going on that may not be as relevant as military or humanitarian assistance, but are important in concrete people's lives. And this war already had a profound effect on so many societies, and we have to value and appreciate that. I hope it stops as fast as it can. But I also hope that all the sacrifices, all the pain and the suffering has not been in vain. That out of all of this, we can build something much better. And that's what gives me strength. And I think that's what's given strength to a lot of people around this conflict as well. As much as I feel for the pain that is ongoing right at this as we speak.
Well, first, I'd really like to thank Anastasia and Dmitry for their really important perspective on this that we are not hearing in this country. I think this is so difficult because my country, my government, the government I pay taxes to, the government that claims to operate in my name, has been responsible for so much suffering around the world, from its origins right through to today. And for us to figure out how to take that into account while building the kind of global movement, and I agree, we need a new name. Civil society really doesn't make it, but a new movement of people, a people's movement around the world, to learn the lessons that we're seeing here. Once again, we're seeing that the issues of racism and hypocrisy and xenophobia are not only challenges for us in the United States, they are global challenges that we have to face globally. The challenge of authoritarianism, we saw it with Trump, we're seeing it around the world in so many countries, leads to the horrors of these kinds of wars. And if we don't build a global movement, we will see it again in other places. So we need to simultaneously deal with the urgency of now, which I think means focusing everything on how do we get diplomacy to work, not just as a slogan, but as a reality that can actually stop the killing. And at the same time, look at the lessons that we're seeing from this particular war and make sure that we use them in building the kind of movement around the world that can prevent it from ever happening again.
Thank you all so much, truly. And I hope that you all stay in touch with us. We are a weekly show. We schedule shows every week, and we'll stay on this as much as we can.
Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.